Nebula Nights by Clara Marigold. Chapter 1, A Poem in the Stars. The nebula stretched across the endless void, a ribbon of brilliant violet and electric blue that seemed to pulse with life, swirling in a cosmic dance that defied any attempt to grasp it. To any passing starship, it was an obstacle, a challenge of navigational skill, a remnant of ancient cosmic phenomena left to be admired from a safe distance. But to Niev, it was a canvas, a stage set for the poetry of the universe. Niev had always been a wanderer, never tied to any one place, and never staying long enough to settle anywhere. The stars were her home, the planets merely stopovers. She drifted, not for adventure, but for inspiration. She was a poet, one of the few in a galaxy dominated by pragmatic minds and scientific marvels. To her, the galaxies were not just vast emptiness, but the written words of the cosmos, each celestial body a verse waiting to be discovered. She had found herself near the heart of the nebula during one of her solitary travels, her small craft gliding through the glowing gases and shimmering dust. The windows of her ship reflected the nebula's colors in soft, spectral hues, casting a dreamlike glow across the cabin. Niev sat by the console, scribbling the thoughts that floated like whispers in her mind. Words she had never quite found before, but that seemed to be coming together now, as if the nebula itself was guiding her pen. She had written a few lines when a sudden jolt shook the ship. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to draw her attention away from her work. Frowning, she checked the instruments. The navigation systems flickered and a low hum emanated from the engine. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't close enough to any known station, and the nebula was notoriously unpredictable. She ran a quick diagnostic scan. The results were concerning. A systems malfunction. Nothing too major, but enough to make her situation more complicated. She sighed, pushing herself out of her chair. Just what I need, she muttered to herself. She knew she'd have to land somewhere, find some kind of station or spaceport to fix it, but as she reached for the comms console, her ship was rocked once again, this time more violently. The hum turned into a growl, and a series of warning lights flashed in front of her. She tried to stabilize the craft, but the ship shuddered, and the starboard side buckled under an unknown force. The engines sputtered, and everything went dark. She gripped the console for support, her heart pounding. Before she could even react, the world outside the windows of her ship turned a blur of purple and black, and then, silence. When Niev awoke, it was not to the familiar hum of her ship's engines or the comfort of the stars around her. Instead, she was surrounded by an eerie quiet. The soft, gentle glow of the nebula still filled her viewports, but there was no movement. She tried to shake off the lingering grogginess from the unconsciousness that had overtaken her, sitting up and looking around the cabin. The lights were dim but functional, though her console was completely offline. Great, she muttered. No comms. No navigation. She unbuckled herself from the pilot's seat and stood, stretching her limbs. She didn't even know how long she had been out. Glancing at the control panel, she saw that the power was still functional, albeit low. The engines had completely shut down. Her thoughts quickly ran through her options. She needed to get out of this nebula before the energy drained entirely. But first, she had to figure out where she was. Her ship had drifted too far, far beyond where any outposts or stations would be. The nearest one was still several days away, if she could even reach it. She sighed and made her way to the rear of the ship, where the small auxiliary shuttle was stored. At the very least, she could use it to scout ahead, try to locate a safer spot to land, but just as she was about to open the shuttle bay, a loud, sharp bang echoed through the hull of the ship, followed by the sound of something, or someone, scraping across the outer surface of the ship. Nia froze, her hand instinctively went to the blaster she kept hidden at her side, though she wasn't sure why. There was no way anyone would be out here. She was far from the trade lanes, too deep in the nebula for anyone to be foolish enough to approach. But the noise persisted, a rapid tapping, as if someone was attempting to get her attention. She hesitated, then pressed her face against the viewport. Her eyes went wide as they took in the sight before her. A figure, clad in dark, sleek armor, was tethered to her ship, using a set of magnetic boots to scale the surface. They moved with purpose, a quiet efficiency that spoke of a well-trained individual. Her first thought was a bounty hunter. But why would someone be out here, in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. No one came out to the nebula unless they had a reason. And if this person had a reason to be here, that meant they were either following her, or something much worse. She pulled away from the viewport and backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no time to think. Her ship was compromised, and whoever this person was, they were no friend. She had to get out of there before she became part of some strange game she didn't understand. She raced back to the cockpit, struggling to think clearly. The auxiliary shuttle was her best shot, but it wasn't going to be easy to launch from here. She would have to repair the damage first, but just as she sat down at the controls to attempt the repair, her comm system blinked to life, startling her. A voice crackled through the static, faint but clear. "This is Captain Soren of the Blackstone. We've received your distress signal. We're approaching your location now. Stand by." The last thing Niev expected was to hear another human voice out here in the void. But there it was. And just as suddenly as it came, the voice cut off, leaving her alone in her thoughts once more. Captain Soren. Who was he? And why was he here? Niev took a steadying breath, pressing her fingers against the comms panel. "Thank you for responding, Captain. I'll be standing by." But deep down, she knew that the situation was far from over. She had just made her first contact with a person in what felt like forever. And somehow, she knew this encounter was only the beginning of something much more complicated. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the nebula once more. The stars twinkled in the distance, each one seemingly beckoning to her, offering the promise of new worlds to discover. But there, in the heart of the nebula, a new story had just begun. One that was written not by the stars themselves, but by the two souls about to cross paths in this cosmic void. And for Niev, the poet, this was only the start of a new poem. Chapter 2: An Unexpected Ally. The hum of her ship's damaged systems was a constant reminder of the precariousness of Niev's situation. Her fingers hovered over the damaged console, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the strange figure now tethered to her ship. The more she thought about it, the more the reality of it began to set in. Someone, or something, had followed her into the nebula. Why? And who were they? A bounty hunter, a rogue trader, or perhaps something worse? There was no way to know, but Niamh's instincts told her one thing: this wasn't just a coincidence. Her pulse quickened as the small comm panel blinked back to life. The crackling voice of Captain Soren cut through the static again, louder this time. "This is Captain Soren of the Blackstone. We're approaching your coordinates. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Sit tight." She swallowed, the unease settling deeper in her stomach. The Blackstone? That wasn't just any civilian vessel. The name carried weight, especially out here in the forgotten corners of the galaxy. The Blackstone was known to most, a heavily armed freighter that was rumored to have ties to some of the more unsavory factions in the galaxy. It didn't fit the profile of someone who would come to the aid of a stranded wanderer. Niamh shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. Right now, she had more pressing concerns. Whoever Captain Soren was, she wasn't going to just wait for him to arrive. She had to be prepared. She was no stranger to danger in the deep reaches of space, and whatever game was unfolding, she wasn't going to be caught unawares. Racing through the ship, she grabbed her tools and made her way to the auxiliary shuttle. If the shuttle was still in good enough condition, it could give her the advantage. She needed to know what she was dealing with before anyone, or anything, got close. As she prepared the shuttle systems, her mind continued to replay the strange encounter on the hull. That figure, so deliberate in their movements, had to be someone trained. They were no amateur, that much was certain. But who were they working for? And more importantly, why had they targeted her? Niamh's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a metallic thud from outside the ship, followed by a faint scraping. She froze. They were closer now, whatever they were. Before she could make a decision, her comms buzzed again. This time, the voice was more insistent. "Are you receiving this? This is Captain Soren, again. We are 3 minutes out. You need to hold position. I'll explain everything when we dock." Niamh gritted her teeth, staring at the panel. She didn't trust this sudden offer of help, but it didn't matter. She needed answers. And if Captain Soren was really headed her way, then there was only one thing to do: wait. Moments later, the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine filled the air as the Blackstone drifted into view. Niamh's eyes narrowed as the massive ship appeared against the glowing backdrop of the nebula, casting an ominous shadow over her own small vessel. It was a ship built for battle, sleek, dark, and far too dangerous looking for her liking. A voice crackled in her earpiece. "Prepare to be boarded," Captain Soren's voice rang out, calm but commanding. "Don't make any sudden moves." Niamh's hand instinctively moved to her blaster, though she doubted it would do much good if things went south. But as the ship docked and the airlock hissed open, a chill ran through her. This wasn't just a simple rescue. The Blackstone hadn't come to help her out of kindness. Something else was at play. The door to the airlock slid open, and there stood Captain Soren, tall and imposing in his dark uniform. His face was shadowed by the low light from the nebula, but there was no mistaking the cold, calculating gaze in his eyes. He was everything Niamh expected: composed, professional, but there was a certain edge to him, something that made her uneasy. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, stepping inside the small cabin. His voice was steady, controlled. "I'm here to help, but you need to understand, this situation is far bigger than just a stranded ship. I'm not interested in your help, Niev shot back, taking a step back. I didn't ask for your rescue. Captain Soren's lips twitched, though whether it was a smile or a grimace, Niev couldn't tell. I'm not giving you a choice, he said, his eyes flicking to the shuttle. That ship out there, it's no coincidence. You've been marked. Marked? Niev repeated, frowning. Marked by who? Before Soren could answer, the ship's console began to beep, signaling an incoming message. Niev glanced at it, but Captain Soren was already moving toward her, his hand hovering over the panel. His movements were swift, practiced. It's better if I show you, he muttered, tapping a series of commands into the console. A new image flickered on the screen, a holographic projection of a star system, one that was far too familiar to Niev. It was the same nebula, but this time, it was zoomed in, highlighting the hidden asteroids deep within the cloud. This, Soren said, is where things get complicated. Niev's heart skipped a beat. What are you trying to tell me? Those asteroids, he said quietly, contain something far more dangerous than you realize. It's not just a random scattering of space debris. It's a graveyard. Niev stared at the image, unable to make sense of it. A graveyard? Yes, Soren said, his tone darkening. A burial ground for a lost fleet. But that's not what's important right now. What matters is what's still out there. And whoever's after you, they want it. Why me? Niev's voice was barely a whisper. She had no connection to anything in this sector. She was just a poet, a wanderer lost in the stars. Soren paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. You're more connected than you think, he said. And you're about to find out just how deep this goes. Niev swallowed, her mind racing. She had no choice now. She was tangled in something far bigger than she could have ever imagined, and the only way out was forward. But one thing was clear, she wasn't alone in this anymore, and despite herself, Niev couldn't shake the feeling that she was beginning a new chapter of her journey. One that would lead her farther into the unknown than she could have ever anticipated. Chapter 3: The Secrets of the Nebula. The Blackstone's docking clamps resonated with a metallic thud as it fully latched onto Niev's ship, the sound reverberating through the walls of the small cabin. Captain Soren stood at the threshold, waiting for her response, as the distant hum of the nebula outside vibrated through the hull. Niev stared at the image of the asteroid field flickering on the console, the unsettling glow of the nebula casting strange shadows on the walls of the cramped cabin. You're telling me, Niev began, her voice steady but skeptical, that an entire fleet was lost in this nebula, and I just happened to wander into the middle of it? Soren nodded, his gaze never wavering. It's not a coincidence. The nebula's shifting clouds have a unique electromagnetic field. It distorts both space and time. It's why ships and people have gotten lost here for centuries. Some disappear without a trace. Others find something they weren't supposed to. Niev clenched her jaw. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her calm. The stories about the nebula were far from reassuring. She'd heard whispers from travelers in the outer sectors, stories about ships vanishing, never to be seen again, as if the nebula itself was a predator, preying on the unwary. "But why me?" she asked again, her voice now laced with frustration. "What makes me so special? I'm just an inventor, a poet with a penchant for getting lost." Soren's eyes flickered with something unreadable, a hesitation that lasted only a moment. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You might not know it, but you've stumbled onto something far bigger than a lost fleet or a few unexplained disappearances." Niamh's brow furrowed. "A treasure," she guessed, not even bothering to hide the cynicism in her tone. She had encountered enough treasure hunters in her travels to know that the promise of ancient riches was often nothing more than a dangerous, delusional pursuit. Soren didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and gestured for her to follow him. With a quiet sigh, Niamh followed the captain through the narrow passageways of the Blackstone, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows as they made their way to the central control deck. Once there, Soren gestured to the holographic display in the center of the room. The nebula's vast cloud formations rippled before her eyes, a swirling mass of gas and dust that stretched for light years in every direction. "This," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "is not just a nebula. It's a graveyard. A resting place for a fleet that disappeared hundreds of years ago, long before your time. And something is still out there, hidden in the remains of those ships." Niamh watched the display closely, her thoughts churning. A fleet of warships? What could be so important that someone would risk coming here after all these years? Soren's eyes hardened. Not just any fleet. A fleet carrying knowledge, technology beyond anything we have now. And now it's being hunted. By people who would kill to get their hands on it. Niamh blinked in surprise, her instincts telling her that Soren wasn't just talking about old relics or ancient weapons. This was something deeper, darker. A technology powerful enough to make even the most hardened criminals risk their lives in the heart of one of the most dangerous places in the galaxy. "Who's hunting it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A group that calls themselves the Helix Order," Soren answered, his tone clipped. "A mercenary faction. Dangerous. Ruthless. They'll do anything to get what they want. And they know exactly where you are." Niamh's heart skipped a beat. The Helix Order. She had heard whispers of them, the mercenaries with connections stretching across the galaxy, always willing to do whatever it took for the highest bidder. And now they were after something buried in the heart of the nebula. Something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. Niamh's gaze flickered back to the nebula's shifting clouds on the screen, and a chill ran down her spine. She wasn't sure what she had stumbled into, but she knew one thing: she couldn't turn back now. "How do you know all this?" she asked, unable to hold back the question. "How did you get involved?" Soren's expression darkened. He walked to the edge of the control deck, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the nebula, his silhouette framed by the light from the swirling cosmic clouds. For a moment, he said nothing, and Niamh wondered if he would even answer. Finally, his voice came, quiet and heavy with a weight of something he hadn't shared. "I'm here because I have my own reasons," he said, his gaze distant. "I was once part of the Order, but not by choice. I left when I realized how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted." Niamh's curiosity piqued. She wasn't sure what Soren's past had to do with her, but there was something in the way he spoke that told her it was important. His voice held the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much, someone who had walked away from something dark and dangerous. She had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but she couldn't deny it. Soren was tangled in it, just as much as she was. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "What do you gain from this?" Soren turned, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something beneath it, something softer, more vulnerable, "Because," he said quietly, "I want to make sure that what's buried in that nebula doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And because I think you might be the key to finding it before they do." Nia frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. She had no idea what Soren saw in her, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary salvage operation. This was a race against time. And the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady as she met his gaze. Soren's lips curled into a rare, fleeting smile. "We start by getting to the heart of the nebula. We find the fleet's remains, and hope we're not too late." The air around them seemed to hum with a new energy, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Niev might not know what awaited them in the depths of the nebula, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't walking this path alone anymore. And, for better or worse, she had just signed up for a journey that would change everything. Chapter 4: Into the Abyss. The silence of space was like a heavy blanket, suffocating and all-encompassing. Outside the hull of the Blackstone, the nebula's colors swirled in an eerie dance of violet and gold, casting a soft glow across the ship's control panel. Niev sat beside Captain Soren in the cockpit, watching as he navigated the ship through the thick mists of the galactic anomaly. "How much longer until we reach the coordinates?" Niev asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled between them since their departure. She didn't expect an answer immediately, but the nervous tension in her chest demanded she speak. Soren's hands moved deftly over the controls, his face calm, even in the face of the unknown. "A few more hours," he replied, his eyes scanning the displays. His usual guarded demeanor had softened slightly since they had left the station, but Niev knew better than to let her guard down too much. This was still the same man with secrets he hadn't fully shared with her. "The closer we get to the center, the stronger the nebula's magnetic interference becomes. We need to stay on course." Niev nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Space travel had always been a blur of technological jargon and complicated equations that her scattered thoughts had trouble following. The nebula, though, had captured her full attention. Its beauty was deceptive, its vastness, its unpredictable currents, all hidden beneath a veil of cosmic clouds that seemed to hum with a life of their own. They were headed to the heart of it, where, according to Soren, the lost fleet had been swallowed up centuries ago. Niev sat back in her seat, staring at the view of the nebula swirling outside. She had expected space to be a bit more open. Vast, yes. Beautiful, yes. But never claustrophobic. Never unnerving. The nebula wasn't just a physical place, it was a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. Its colors twisted like spectral fingers, drawing them deeper into its heart. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked quietly, half to herself, Soren glanced over at her. His lips quirked into a wry smile. Not really. But you get used to the feeling of being small. Of knowing that you're nothing more than a speck of dust in the vastness of it all. She couldn't argue with that. She had often thought of herself that way. Just a speck. A small, insignificant thing in a universe far larger than she could ever comprehend. But now, she was here, on a strange ship with a mysterious man, about to dive into the heart of one of the most dangerous regions of space. "Do you really think there's something left of the fleet?" she asked, glancing at him sideways. The idea of ancient warships, long dead and drifting in the dark, seemed like something from a fairy tale, not reality. Still, she couldn't help but feel a shiver of excitement, mingled with an uncomfortable apprehension. Soren's eyes darkened as he adjusted the controls. "I think there's something more important. It's not about what's left of the ships. It's about the knowledge they carried." He looked at her, his expression more serious than she'd seen it. "The technology. The secrets that could change everything." Nia frowned. "The secrets of a lost fleet. A fleet lost in the Nebula centuries ago." She couldn't wrap her mind around it. "And you're sure this is the right place? That we're not just going in circles?" "Trust me," Soren replied, his voice steady but with an edge of steel in it. "We're close." The ship jolted, a brief but sharp shudder running through its hull. Niamh's hand instinctively gripped the armrest as the stars outside the window seemed to blur and warp. "What the hell was that?" Niamh hissed, her pulse spiking as her eyes darted to the readouts. "Magnetic turbulence," Soren said quickly, his fingers flying over the controls. "The closer we get to the center, the more erratic the ship's movements become. Just hold on tight." Niamh gritted her teeth. She wasn't one to give in to fear easily, but the violent shaking rattled her nerves. The ship bucked again, this time with a force that made the cockpit lights flicker. "How do we navigate through this?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Soren's gaze was locked onto the ship's instruments, his expression intense. "We use the gravitational pull of the nebula itself. It's the only way through. It'll guide us to the coordinates we need." The view outside warped again, the nebula's gaseous tendrils twisting in on themselves, now a pulsing vortex of light and shadow. Niamh's heart raced as she leaned forward, her hands gripping the seat, eyes wide as the swirling mass of color seemed to move, to breathe. She could feel it, a strange pull, an invisible force guiding them deeper. The ship groaned as they pushed through another layer of turbulent energy. The lights dimmed, flickering as the power fluctuated under the strain. For a brief moment, the whole universe outside seemed to collapse inward, and Niamh felt a strange sensation, like they were falling, not through space, but through time itself. And then, just as quickly, the turbulence ceased. The ship floated within a silent, eerie calm, suspended at the center of a vast nothingness. Niamh looked out the window, her breath catching. The stars had disappeared, replaced by a void filled with swirling mist and faint, glowing shapes. Ahead of them lay the wreckage, a fleet of old, weathered ships, their hulls darkened and decaying, yet still hauntingly magnificent. They had the appearance of ancient, skeletal giants, floating aimlessly in the center of the nebula, their outlines barely visible against the swirling clouds. Soren's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "We're here." Niamh's breath caught in her throat. The fleet. She had imagined it in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for this sight. These were not just ships. These were monuments, relics of a forgotten time. And now, they were their only hope for survival. "Now what?" Niamh asked, her voice trembling. "Now we find the knowledge they left behind," Soren replied, a sense of determination in his voice. "We make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Niamh swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. She wasn't sure if they were about to uncover something that could save the galaxy, or if they were about to awaken something far worse, but there was no turning back now. The abyss had opened, and they had stepped into it. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Echoes. The Blackstone drifted silently through the remains of the lost fleet, its engines humming softly in the otherwise quiet abyss. The nebula stretched out in every direction, a swirling sea of gas and dust. Niamh gazed out the viewport, her eyes fixed on the ghostly ships that floated in the vast emptiness. They were magnificent, though their once proud hulls were now weathered and scarred by time and the unforgiving forces of the nebula. "Is it always like this?" Niamh whispered, her voice barely breaking the heavy silence. She turned her gaze to Soren, who was still hunched over the control panel, his expression unreadable. "How do you live with this constant isolation?" Soren didn't immediately answer. His fingers moved over the controls with practiced ease, guiding the Blackstone between the scattered debris and the hulking remains of ships. His brow was furrowed in concentration, though Niamh caught a fleeting glimpse of something else in his eyes, a flicker of loneliness, something that mirrored the very emptiness around them. "It's different when you're used to it," he finally replied, his voice low and calm. "You get used to the quiet, to the vastness. But it's never really peaceful." Niamh nodded, trying to wrap her mind around his words. The deep, endless silence of space had an unsettling quality to it. And the longer they lingered among the wrecks, the more she felt a creeping sense of dread coil in her chest. There was something about this place, something unnatural about the way the ships had been abandoned here, forgotten by time and all but lost to history. "Do you think they left anything behind?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Soren looked at her then, his sharp eyes piercing through the dim glow of the cockpit. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he seemed to weigh her question before responding. "I think there's something here. Something important. The fleet didn't just disappear without a reason. The knowledge they carried, it could change everything. If we can find it. If we can make sense of it." A chill ran down Niamh's spine as she looked back at the wrecks. The ships, though ancient and decaying, still held a certain dignity in their skeletal forms. Their sheer size and silent presence seemed to pulse with a forgotten power. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, like the lingering presence of a ghost that refused to leave. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her, watching, waiting. "Let's start with the closest one," Soren said, breaking her reverie. "We'll board it, see what we can find." Niamh nodded, trying to push down the unease swirling in her chest. Her mind raced with possibilities, though she didn't quite understand what they were searching for. Ancient technology, lost knowledge, or something far more dangerous. The ship's engines hummed as Soren guided them closer to the nearest wreck. It was a massive vessel, one that looked like it had once been a formidable warship. Its surface was scarred with deep gouges and punctured holes, evidence of a violent past. Yet, despite its dilapidated condition, there was something oddly beautiful about it. Its sleek, almost graceful curves, even in death. As the Blackstone drew near, the gravity on the deck shifted slightly, the ship's stabilizers adjusting to the proximity of the wreck. The docking bay door hissed open, and Soren turned to Niev, his face solemn. "Ready?" he asked, his voice serious. Niev hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never been one for danger, but something about this felt different. The unknown, the thrill of discovery, and the unease that clung to the air, everything seemed to be pulling her forward. She nodded slowly. "Yeah. Let's do it." Together, they made their way to the airlock, where Soren powered up the external suits they would need to board the wreck. Niev's heart thudded in her chest as she adjusted the helmet of her suit, the metallic sound of her breath the only noise in the sterile environment. She could feel the weight of the silence again, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The airlock opened with a hiss, and Niev followed Soren out onto the hull of the wreck. The surface was slick with the remnants of cosmic dust, and the metal felt cold beneath her boots. They moved with purpose, Soren leading the way toward the broken entry point where the ship's outer hull had been torn open. As they approached the breach, Niev's senses heightened, every little noise amplified by the eerie quiet of the nebula. Her fingers tightened around the tool she had grabbed for the task, a sharp sense of awareness prickling up her spine. Soren motioned for her to stay close as they entered the wreck through the jagged opening. Inside, the ship was dark and quiet, its once thriving interior now reduced to cold, empty corridors. Niev's flashlight beam swept across the rusted walls, revealing signs of long-abandoned equipment and forgotten memories. It was as if the crew had simply vanished, leaving everything behind in a hasty, unexplained departure. "Stay alert," Soren murmured as he led the way down a narrow hallway. "We don't know what we'll find in here. This place has been untouched for centuries, but the nebula affects everything. We might not be alone." Niev nodded, her pulse quickening. Something about the abandoned ship unsettled her. It wasn't just the decay or the silence, it was the feeling that they were being watched, that the ship itself was alive, and it didn't want them here. As they continued deeper into the wreck, the air seemed to grow heavier. The walls, once polished and gleaming, were now corroded with age. Strange markings lined the floors and ceilings, symbols she didn't recognize, carved hastily into the metal. Niev's curiosity gnawed at her, and she reached down to examine one of the symbols more closely. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal, and she felt a sudden, sharp jolt of energy ripple through her fingertips. She recoiled, heart pounding, as the air seemed to shimmer around her. For a moment, everything went still. A strange, unearthly hum filled the silence, emanating from deep within the ship, as though the wreck itself were alive, reacting to her touch. "Niev." Soren's voice broke through the momentary trance, and she snapped back to reality. His expression was tense, his eyes scanning the room. Did you feel that? Neve nodded, her chest tightening. Something's here. Something we shouldn't have touched. But it was too late. The hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the very walls of the ship. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness, and then, in the deep, forgotten corners of the wreck, a voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered into the void. "Leave this place." The voice was chilling, and it was not human. Chapter 6, Whispers in the Dark. The voice that had whispered in the darkness sent a cold shiver down Neve's spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something ancient, powerful, and unsettling. The ship seemed to groan under the weight of the silence, as if it were reacting to the voice that had seeped into its very bones. Soren froze, his body tense and rigid. He reached for the flashlight at his belt, his fingers brushing the cold metal as his eyes darted around the pitch-black corridor. The hum had stopped, but the air itself felt charged, alive with a quiet, watchful energy. Neve held her breath, straining to hear anything beyond the rhythmic thudding of her heart. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the stillness. Soren didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be listening, his eyes narrowed as if trying to pick out any movement or sound from the oppressive blackness. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, though there was an edge of something that betrayed his calm facade. "I heard it," he said. "But it's not possible." Neve frowned, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" "It sounded real." "Real doesn't explain why this place has been abandoned for centuries." "And why?" He paused, his gaze flicking to the shadows that seemed to move at the edges of the corridor, though there was nothing physically there. "Why it's still resonating with something." A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The longer they lingered in the wreck, the more she felt the invisible presence pressing in on them, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. Every creak of the ship seemed to echo in the hollow spaces of her mind, and the walls appeared to close in slightly, inch by inch. "We need to keep moving," Soren said, his voice snapping her from her thoughts. He turned quickly, striding forward as he gestured for her to follow. "Stay close." The two of them moved in near silence, their footsteps the only sound as they navigated the dark halls. Neve's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, what had it meant? "Leave this place." It was a warning, a command, but from where? Or who? The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more surreal it felt. The walls began to pulse with faint, undulating lights that shimmered like distant stars, casting fleeting, ghostly shadows along the corridors. Neve tried to focus, to remember why they had come here in the first place, to find something, anything, that could give them answers about the lost fleet. But each step seemed to bring them closer to something far more dangerous than mere knowledge. They turned a corner, and Neve stumbled, her foot catching on a piece of debris. She cursed under her breath, steadying herself with one hand against the wall. As she looked up, something caught her eye, something unusual, something out of place. At first, she couldn't understand what she was seeing, but then it hit her: the floor was covered in symbols. Ancient markings, some glowing faintly, others barely visible beneath layers of grime and decay. She crouched down to inspect them, her pulse quickening. The symbols were etched into the metal with a precision that was far beyond anything she had seen before. They were unlike any language she had encountered, yet there was a strange familiarity to them. A feeling of recognition, something buried deep in her memory. "What is this?" she muttered to herself. Soren turned to look over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the symbols. He approached slowly, a low growl of warning in his throat. "Don't touch them," he said, his voice low. "These markings, they're not just decorative. They're part of a containment system. Something's locked in here." Niamh's hand hovered above the markings, her fingers tingling with the energy that seemed to radiate from them. "What do you mean, locked in?" Soren's gaze flicked to the walls, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. "I've heard rumors. There were stories about a long-lost sect of an ancient race that used this technology to trap dangerous entities. They were a lost civilization, one that vanished long before anyone knew what they were dealing with. Some say they never really disappeared, they're still here. Trapped in places like this." Niamh felt a chill run through her as the words sunk in. "You think we've found one of them?" Soren didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the markings, as if he could sense the same unease in them that she felt. Then, without warning, he spun toward her. "We need to get out of here. Now." The urgency in his voice spurred her into action. She didn't question him, she didn't need to. She could feel it, too. Whatever had been locked away in the ship, it was starting to stir, and the longer they stayed, the more dangerous it would become. But just as she turned to follow Soren, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the air, an unearthly shriek that rattled her bones. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and a tremor ran through the floor beneath their feet. Niamh froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is that?" Soren didn't look back. His pace quickened, his movements more frantic. "That's not a good sign." Before they could make another move, the lights flickered violently, then went out completely. They were plunged into total darkness, the cold weight of the unknown pressing in on them. The air was thick with something ancient, something that didn't belong in the universe. The hum, the strange energy, everything was shifting, warping, as if the ship itself were coming alive. "Run!" Soren shouted, grabbing Niamh's arm and pulling her along. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the thick silence. But something was behind them, something that was growing closer, faster, relentlessly pursuing them. The ship groaned under the pressure of the growing force, its hull shaking as if it were struggling to contain whatever had been awakened. Niamh glanced over her shoulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but all she saw were shadows, shifting, formless shapes that seemed to close in on them with each passing second. They had to get out. They had to escape. But as they rounded the corner, the doorway ahead of them slammed shut with an earth-shattering noise. That it was too late, the voice returned, clearer this time, closer. "Leave, or be consumed." Soren grabbed Niamh's hand, pulling her into a narrow side passage just as the shadows closed in around them. They were trapped. The ship, it seemed, had no intention of letting them go. Chapter 7: The Echo of the Past. The darkness seemed to close in around them, an ever-encroaching weight. Niamh's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts as she and Soren stood frozen in the narrow passage. The walls of the ship, once cold and abandoned, now felt alive with an unsettling energy. The faint glow of the symbols beneath their feet flickered as if reacting to the presence of whatever force was hunting them. "What's happening?" Niev whispered, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep the panic at bay. She could feel the air around them vibrating with something far more ancient and dangerous than they had ever expected. Soren's face was a mask of determination, though she could see the faintest flicker of fear in his eyes. His hand gripped hers tightly, pulling her along as he moved swiftly down the passage. The corridor was narrow and twisted, like the ship was conspiring to lead them deeper into its maw. "I don't know," Soren muttered under his breath, his gaze darting around. "But we have to keep moving. This place, it's reacting to us, and not in a good way." The oppressive silence was broken by another high-pitched, screeching noise, a sound that felt as if it were tearing through the very fabric of space itself. It made Niev's skin crawl, a shiver running down her spine. It was a warning, a sound that hadn't been heard in eons, reverberating from deep within the ship's ancient core. She could almost feel the weight of the ship's past pressing against her, as if its history was beginning to bleed into the present. They turned another corner, and Niev's breath hitched. The hallway opened up into a large chamber, dimly lit by faint pulses of light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The ceiling arched high above them, and there, in the center of the room, was a large, cylindrical structure, pulsating with the same strange energy that had drawn them here. It was not unlike the containment chamber they had seen earlier, but far more intricate and ominous. "What is that?" Niev asked, her voice barely a whisper. Soren didn't answer at first. He stepped forward cautiously, his hand on his weapon as he surveyed the room. "That," he said slowly, "is the heart of the ship. The core. And it's been waiting for something." Niev felt the air grow heavier as she approached the structure. There were more symbols etched into the walls here, some of them moving, shifting like they were alive. The pattern seemed to respond to her presence, swirling with a faint, eerie light. "Is that a gate?" she asked, her voice filled with awe and fear. Soren nodded grimly. "Not just a gate. It's a nexus. A rift. This ship, the civilization that built it, they didn't just travel through space. They tapped into something darker. This core can open pathways, but it's not meant to be controlled by anyone." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the chamber seemed to hum louder, as if awakening from a long slumber. Niev staggered, grabbing onto Soren for balance. "We need to get out of here," Soren said, his voice tight. "Now." But as he turned to leave, something stopped them. The symbols on the walls flashed, and a cold, swirling mist began to rise from the floor. The air grew thick with a strange, almost tangible presence, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber. "Why do you awaken me?" The voice was a low growl, ancient and full of bitterness. It felt like a living thing, crawling inside her mind. The past was meant to be forgotten. Niev's stomach twisted, and she felt her throat tighten. "What is that?" she gasped. Soren's expression hardened. "It's one of them," he said quietly. "The beings the ancients trapped here." The mist thickened, swirling faster as if feeding off their fear. The voice seemed to grow louder, its power undeniable. The walls around them vibrated, and the air felt like it was closing in. "You should not have come," the voice intoned. Now, you will join me in the depths of the forgotten. Niamh's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the past, of the entity that had been trapped here for so long, pressing down on them. Whatever it was ancient, and it was not happy they had disturbed its prison. Get ready, Soren whispered urgently. We need to move fast. Don't let the mist touch you. The room was filling with the mist at an alarming rate, the swirling vapor making it harder to see and breathe. The voice seemed to reverberate within her chest, vibrating with power. It was everywhere, creeping into her thoughts, whispering promises of forgotten knowledge and power beyond imagination, but Niamh knew better. Whatever it offered was a trap, a snare designed to consume anyone foolish enough to fall for its lure. She grabbed Soren's arm, her grip tight. We have to go, she said, more forcefully this time. Without another word, they ran, pushing through the thickening mist. The walls seemed to shift around them, making the way forward feel like an endless maze. Every turn, every corner felt like it led them deeper into the heart of the ship, and deeper into the grasp of whatever was trying to claim them. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't. The voice, now louder, more insistent, seemed to echo in the back of their minds, filling the air with dread. Leave me, it howled. Leave this place and never return, or be bound to it forever. Niamh's pulse was racing as they finally reached the doorway leading to the ship's exterior. But just as they were about to step through, the ground beneath them trembled again, and a sudden force slammed into their chests, throwing them backward. The mist was everywhere now, filling their lungs, choking them as they struggled to regain their footing. Niamh's vision blurred, the world spinning around her. And then, through the haze, she saw it, a figure emerging from the swirling mist, tall and dark, cloaked in shadows. It was not human. It was one of them, and it was coming for them. Run! Soren shouted, but Niamh could barely hear him over the pounding in her head. She felt her legs weaken, the energy draining from her body as if the very air were stealing her strength. The figure drew closer, its eyes glowing with an unholy light, its form twisting and distorting in ways that defied logic. But then, something else happened. A sudden surge of energy shot through Niamh's body, and she gasped as it filled her veins like fire. Her heart raced, and the room around her seemed to shift. The mist began to recede, the figure faltering for just a moment, as if it too were surprised by the change. Niamh didn't know where the power had come from, but she felt it surge within her, filling her with strength. She reached out toward Soren, grabbing his hand, pulling him to his feet. We can't stop now, she said, her voice stronger than before. We can fight this. The ship trembled, but this time, it was not the mist that was closing in, it was something else. Something that would give them the chance to escape. Chapter 8, The Riddle of the Nebula. The chaos of the past few hours left Niamh breathless, every nerve in her body firing with adrenaline as she and Soren sprinted through the narrow corridors of the ship. The figure they had encountered, that dark presence rising from the mist, had been enough to push them further, faster, but the energy surging through Niamh was unlike anything she had ever felt. It had been the difference between life and death, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow becoming part of this ship, part of its strange and terrifying power. Keep moving, Soren urged, his grip tight on her arm as he guided her through the winding passageways. We don't know how long we have before the core activates again. Niamh could hear the deep, resonant hum of the ship's engines now, a constant vibration beneath their feet. The whole place felt alive, thrumming with energy, and she was certain that whatever ancient force had been bound here for centuries was stirring once more. She could feel it in the air, the heaviness of the ship pressing in around them like a trap, but there was no turning back. Not now. What was that thing? Niev gasped, trying to catch her breath. The creature in the mist. An ancient entity, Soren replied with a grim edge to his voice. One of the beings the ship's builders trapped here, like I said. They were more than just explorers. They were, well, let's say they were trying to control things they shouldn't have. Things that go beyond the physical realm. He led her to a small, round door at the end of the corridor. We need to get to the observation deck. From there, we can figure out our next move. Niev's eyes darted to the door. Her heart raced, and though her body screamed for rest, she knew they couldn't afford to stop. Not until they were far enough from the heart of the ship, away from whatever forces were still lingering there. Soren punched in a code on the nearby panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The room beyond was dimly lit by pale, blue lights, the floor strewn with debris from the ship's long disuse. It looked like an old storage room, though the view through the transparent viewport was breathtaking. Outside, the nebula stretched across the vastness of space, a swirling tapestry of purple and green gas clouds, punctuated by brilliant flashes of distant stars. It was like standing on the edge of the universe itself. Niev felt a sense of awe wash over her, and for a moment, the chaos of the ship faded away. She stepped forward, pressing her hand against the cool glass as she stared out into the nebula's swirling depths. This is what we're up against, Soren said quietly, his voice full of a quiet intensity. This nebula, it's not just a beautiful sight. It's a puzzle. A riddle, one we need to solve if we're going to survive. Niev turned to face him, her brow furrowed. A riddle? He nodded. The ship was built to traverse the nebula, but not just for travel. It was meant to tap into the power of the nebula itself. The energy here is unlike anything we've encountered before. It's alive. It responds to us, to our thoughts, to our emotions. And that's what makes it dangerous. She stepped back from the window, her mind whirling. So, if the nebula is alive, then, is that what we're dealing with? Is it controlling the ship? Is it? No, Soren cut in sharply. The nebula doesn't control the ship. But the ship's creators did something to try and harness its power. They bound the energy to the ship, tried to use it to fuel their own technology, but something went wrong. The energy in the nebula started to fight back. The core, the heart of the ship, it was the final key to unlocking its true potential. But it wasn't supposed to be used. Not by them. And definitely not by anyone else. Niev could feel the weight of his words, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The ship, the ancient beings, the nebula, it was all connected. The power inside the core wasn't just an energy source, it was a force far more ancient and dangerous than they could have imagined. It was something that didn't belong to anyone, something that could consume them all if they weren't careful. So, what do we do? She asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. How do we stop it? Soren turned and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. There's a way to sever the connection between the ship and the nebula. But it's not going to be easy. The core needs to be deactivated, but it's not a simple matter of just shutting it down. The ship's systems are tied directly into the nebula's energy fields. If we tamper with the wrong part, the entire ship could collapse in on itself. So we need to find the right part, Neve said, determination lacing her words. Where do we start? Soren's eyes met hers, and for a moment, they were silent, the weight of their journey pressing down on both of them. There's a place, he said finally. A place deep within the heart of the ship. It's a control chamber, hidden from the main systems. Only a few people knew it existed. I can guide you there, but we'll have to move fast. The ship's waking up, and the closer we get to the core, the more unstable everything will become. Neve nodded, her resolve hardening. Then let's go. As they turned to leave the room, the ship's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The hum of the engines grew louder, more urgent. The presence of the nebula outside seemed to press in on them, like it was watching, waiting, and as they made their way back through the corridors, Neve couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nebula's riddle was still far from solved. And with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher, the ship was alive. And it wasn't about to let them leave without a price. Chapter 9, The Heart of the Ship. The corridors seemed endless, each turn twisting them further into the depths of the ship. Neve's legs burned with fatigue, but the sense of urgency, of something unseen trailing just behind them, kept her moving. Soren led the way with a steady confidence, his eyes always scanning the path ahead, never allowing them to linger too long in one spot. This way, he murmured, veering off down a narrow passage. The walls were cold to the touch, metal slick and unyielding. The ship felt even older now, the air heavy with dust and forgotten history. They were getting closer to the heart of it all, closer to the place where the ship's creators had once harnessed the nebula's energy, and closer to the riddle they had to solve if they were ever going to escape. The hum of the ship's engines had changed. It was deeper now, more resonant. Almost as if the ship itself was waking up from a long slumber, aware of their presence. The walls vibrated slightly underfoot, the sound of distant thrum pulsing in the back of her skull. You feel it, don't you? Neve asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Soren didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at her from the corner of his eye, the tension in his expression more evident than ever. I do. We're getting close. He led her to another sealed door, much larger than any they had encountered so far. The door was black, nearly seamless, and adorned with symbols Neve didn't recognize. It almost looked as though the ship had grown around it, the room beyond too important to ever be easily accessed. Is this it? Neve asked, her pulse quickening. Soren nodded, then punched in a code. The door clicked, and with a deep groan of metal, it slowly slid open. They stepped into the room beyond that. It was cavernous. The control chamber, hidden deep within the ship, was nothing like the rest of the ship. Here, the air felt different, charged, alive. The space pulsed with a faint glow emanating from a series of intricate panels embedded in the floor and walls. The room was circular, with a large central platform rising above the ground like a stage, an eerie green light flickering from beneath its surface. What is this place? Niev breathed, awe and fear battling in her chest. This is where it all started, Soren said, his voice tight. The core of the ship. The place where the builders tried to tap into the nebula's power. They didn't just want to use it for fuel, they tried to merge the ship's systems with the energy itself, to make it alive. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought they could control it. They were wrong. Niev stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the glowing panel. It was warm to the touch, humming with power, almost as though it were alive, responding to her presence. So, this is the source? She asked, her voice reverberating slightly as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The core. Soren didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the room with intense focus. He moved toward a control panel at the far end of the chamber, muttering under his breath as his fingers danced across the interface. It's not the core itself, he said finally, his gaze fixed on the display. But this chamber controls the flow of energy from the nebula to the ship's systems. If we can stop the energy from feeding into the core, Niev watched him, trying to keep her mind focused. But how do we do that? How do we stop it? That's the tricky part, Soren muttered. He continued to work at the panel, his brow furrowed in concentration. We'll need to sever the link between the ship and the nebula. The energy flows through these conduits and into the heart of the ship. If we cut it off here, we can stop the ship from drawing power from the nebula. But it's not just a simple switch. We'll have to access the main valve control and reroute the energy flow manually. Niev felt a chill creep over her. The room was heavy with the palpable presence of something vast and unknowable. She could feel it in the air, the same sense of life, of being watched, that she had felt since the moment she first set foot on this ship. Is there a way to shut the whole thing down? She asked, her voice small in the cavernous room. Soren turned to face her, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of resolve and wariness. I can shut down the flow, but not permanently. There's no way to completely sever the link between the ship and the nebula without risking the collapse of the whole system. We need to neutralize it. Now. Just then, the humming in the room grew louder, more pronounced, until it seemed to shake the very air around them. The walls quivered, the panels flickering erratically. A deep, resonant sound thrummed through the ship, like a heartbeat, a warning. That's not us, Niev said, her voice tense. Something's coming. Soren's face paled. It's the ship, the nebula's energy is reacting to us. It's trying to stop us. Without warning, the lights in the room flickered out, plunging them into darkness. The only light now came from the faint green glow of the energy panels, casting eerie shadows across the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and Niev could feel a pressure building in her chest, as though the very atmosphere was tightening around her. Soren moved quickly to the control panel, his hands flying across the interface. We don't have much time. The nebula's power is fighting back. If we don't stop it now, we'll never make it out of here. Niev felt a surge of determination, even as fear tugged at the edges of her mind. The ship, the nebula, the energy, it was all connected, and they were running out of time. She had to trust that Soren knew what he was doing. With every passing second, the ship seemed to grow more alive, more aware of their presence. And with each heartbeat, the pressure inside her chest intensified. Ready? Soren's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and urgent. Niev nodded. Do it. With a final, desperate motion, Soren pulled a lever on the panel. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crash, the entire chamber shook, the energy panels flaring brightly, and the walls groaned under the strain. The ship's heartbeat quickened, thrumming with a frantic intensity. For a moment, everything went silent, and then, a soft hum, a whisper of energy, and the nebula's overwhelming presence began to recede. But as the calm settled in, Niev could still feel it. The ship was alive, and its heartbeat was far from done. The riddle had only just begun. Chapter 10: The Last Song of the Stars. The silence was overwhelming. For a moment, Niev thought her heart had stopped, her breath caught in her throat as the deep, resonant hum of the ship faded into the distance. The walls no longer trembled. The panels had gone dark, the energy that had once filled the air now nothing more than a fading echo. The tension that had suffocated them for so long seemed to lift, as though the nebula itself had taken a step back, allowing them to breathe again. But as the last of the hums faded, a new sound filled the room, a soft, melodic whisper. It was not a sound created by the ship or the nebula's power. It was something deeper, something that resonated with the very essence of the ship itself. A song. Niev turned to Soren, her eyes wide with confusion. What's happening? What is that sound? Soren stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes searching the room as if he were hearing something she couldn't. The ship, it's singing, he said quietly, his voice trembling. The core, it's alive. It's trying to communicate. The room seemed to pulse in time with the melody, the soft vibration matching the rhythm of the song. The walls, the floor, everything in the chamber felt alive, as if the ship were trying to speak to them. The air grew warmer, more familiar, as if it were no longer a foreign, unfeeling place but a living being, struggling to find its voice. Soren's expression softened. For a moment, he looked at peace, his eyes closed as he listened to the haunting melody. Niev could sense it too now, the connection, the bond between the ship and the nebula, between the past and the present, between them. It was as though everything had aligned, everything was in its place. They were right, Soren whispered, his voice full of wonder. They couldn't control the nebula's energy, but they could listen to it. They could understand it. Niev took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward the central platform, where the song seemed to originate. The energy panels, now dimmed, flickered as if in response to her movement, as though the ship was recognizing her presence. Can we stop it? Niev asked, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid to hope, afraid that this moment of peace was fleeting. Can we sever the connection once and for all? Soren slowly shook his head. I don't think we can sever it completely. Not without destroying the ship. But, we can learn to live with it. We can find balance. Niev felt a strange peace settle over her, something she hadn't expected. There would be no cataclysmic shutdown, no sudden end. Instead, they had stumbled upon something far more extraordinary, a chance for harmony. The ship, the nebula, the energy, it was not an enemy to fight, but a force to understand. To respect. She looked at Soren, his features soft in the glow of the room's last pulses. He was no longer the stoic captain she had met in the cold corridors of the starship. Now, he was a man who had embraced the mystery, the beauty of this strange place. And somehow, through it all, he had become more than a captain to her. He had become a companion, a fellow traveler on a journey none of them had expected to take. Nia felt the weight of her words before she spoke them, but she couldn't stop herself. So, what happens now? Soren met her gaze, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. Now, we go home. But even as he spoke the words, Nia knew it wouldn't be that simple. Home wasn't just a place, it was a journey. And with every step they had taken together, the line between where they came from and where they were going had blurred. The stars had shown them that there were no easy answers, no simple paths. The ship hummed again, louder this time, as if it were joining in their conversation, as if it had a story to tell. Its song was bittersweet, as though it knew its time was nearing an end. But there was no fear in it, only acceptance. Soren turned to the control panel, and for a moment, Nia wondered if he had made his decision. His fingers hovered over the interface, but he didn't press any buttons. He simply stood there, watching the ship around them, feeling the pulse of life in its walls. Then, he finally turned back to her. "Are you ready?" Nia looked at him, her heart full, her mind clearer than it had ever been. "I'm ready." With a soft click, the platform beneath their feet hummed to life, and the doors to the chamber slid open, revealing the vast expanse of space beyond. The nebula, still swirling with color, hung in the distance, a reminder of all they had been through, of all they had discovered. And as the ship slowly powered up, the last strains of the song still echoing in the background, Nia knew that this was just the beginning. Their journey wasn't over. The stars might be a long way from home, but they had found something even more precious, each other, and that, Nia realized, was all they needed. Together, they stepped into the future.